We introduce insect ecology by looking at the many remarkable features of the insects, their long evolutionary history, important design characteristics, including wings and flight, and the prodigious numbers of species and numbers of individuals per species. Inevitably, such vast richness entails many kinds of interaction, the basis for the study of insect ecology, because individuals and species provide part of the environment which any insect experiences. Ecology is the science of relationships of organisms to their environment, the physical and the biotic components with which they interact. How they relate depends on their design and their behavior, the latter aspect forming part 2 of this book. With millions of species of insects comes the question of how so many can evolve and coexist, subjects addressed in this chapter and other parts of the book. Also, we consider the roles that insects play in ecosystems, and the scientific method employed in their study. These introductory considerations set the stage for expanding many themes in subsequent parts and chapters. Part 2 is devoted to behavioral ecology, Part 3 to species interactions, and Part 4 to population ecology. Moving to larger arrays of interacting species, we devote Part 5 to food webs and communities, and Part 6 to patterns and processes over the Earth's surface. We generally are innately fascinated by insects and other arthropods at a young age, but cultural defects tend to diminish this enjoyment, while enhancing dread and avoidance. With more understanding provided by insect ecology, we can recover a sense of wonder, and a knowledge of belonging with insects on this planet. 1. The scope of insect ecology. Everybody is conscious of insects, and even concerned about them. In fact, we each have an ecological relationship with their kind. We share our houses and gardens with them, our walks and picnics, and our adventures. So should we not understand them? Their richness in species and interactions, their beauty and behavioral intricacy, all enrich our lives if we understand who they are, and what they are doing. Therefore, the ecology of insects is for everybody. Eisner 2003, page 1, in his latest book, For Love of Insects, starts by writing that, this book is about the thrill of discovery. And, Wilson 1994, page 191, in his autobiographical, Naturalist, advised, love the organisms for themselves first, then strain for general explanations, and, with good fortune, discoveries will follow. If they don't, the love and the pleasure will have been enough. Here is sound advice from 2 of the greatest practitioners of entomology and ecology, for discovery is thrilling, and the deeper the fascination one develops, the greater will be the discoveries that follow. When considering the features of insects that make them remarkable, many attributes come to mind. Their diversity of numbers, shapes, colors, and habits are incredible. Their potential for future evolutionary change is unimaginably rich. The ecological interactions that insects enter into are diverse and important, involving consumption of plants, including crops and forest trees, predation on other insects, and ecosystem processes, such as cycling of nutrients and decomposition. Some insects are highly beneficial for humans, while others are harmful. Thus, insect ecology serves the needs of both the desire to understand nature as a basic contribution to knowledge, and the need to solve the practical problems posed by insect pests concerning human hygiene, animal husbandry, agriculture, forestry, horticulture, and the urban environment. We will elaborate on these features of insects, and the need to study and understand them, in the following sections of this chapter, and in the remainder of the book. First, we discuss the evolution and design of insects, before looking at the richness of the insect fauna and their relationships. In the later part of the chapter, we turn our attention to how insects have become so numerous and diverse through adaptive radiation, and their roles in ecosystem processes. 1.1 Fascination with insects. While developing a fascination with insects, we necessarily enter into the whole realm of nature, because insects interact with almost all other living species in one way or another. By studying insects for their own enjoyment, with good fortune, we may perform good science. Nature first, then theory, was the order advised by Wilson, 1994, p. 191. The fascination with insects derives from many of their characteristics. Their charms and annoyances are multifaceted. Insects have inspired art, design, and literature. They act as a significant source of food in some parts of the world. They afflict millions with bites and infections while providing essential services in pollination and ecosystem processes. Their interactions with humans, agricultural crops, forests, livestock, and other domesticated animals make insects of ubiquitous concern. Seldom will a day pass without seeing or interacting with insects. They are so common locally, and widespread geographically, that virtually all humans experience their presence. But, in spite of their commonness, many people misunderstand insects, regarding them as vermin, and are even frightened by some. However, the study of insect ecology can only contribute to our fascination with them, and our admiration for the roles they play in nature and in environments modified by humans. 1.2 Antiquity of insects. The earliest insect fossils date back to about 400 million years ago. Kukulova, Peck 1991, Lavandera 2002, Grimaldi and Engel 2005. Deep in the Devonian period and Paleozoic era. Plants diversified during the Siluro-Devonian explosion, 420–360 Maya, followed by a rapid radiation of insects during the Carboniferous, with an extraordinary emergence of flying insect taxa by 300 million years ago. We can see from figure 1.1 that already in the Devonian, 400 Maya, there is fossil evidence of insects feeding on plants, including generalized foliage feeding, boring internally, and piercing and sucking types, and by 250 million years ago most types of insect feeding were evident and most types of plant parts were fed upon by insects. In the tree fern swamp forests of the late Carboniferous, 308 Maya, the first evidence of gall-inducing insects has been described, and seed predation on seed ferns was evident. As plants diversified, so too did the insects, providing a rich paleoecological background for studies of plant and herbivore interactions. Insects shared the land with other arthropods such as centipedes, millipedes, and spiders through the Devonian and Carboniferous, their distributions being widespread and presumably with high abundance. Their lives were uncomplicated by the presence of vertebrate predators for perhaps 20 to 25 million years. But in the late Devonian, amphibians made a partial entry into the terrestrial fauna, while still breeding in water. Both on land and in water, amphibians were no doubt preying on insects, although impact was probably small, and 20 to 25 million years is a pretty good run without vertebrate predators for the insects. The evolution of flight in insects constituted a breakthrough to an extraordinary adaptive radiation in the late Carboniferous, and adaptive radiation never equaled on this Earth. This was about 150 million years before pterosaurs, birds and bats flew. The conquest of the air, so early among terrestrial animals, was no doubt of prime importance in the spread of insects across the globe. Add to this the sheer age of insects, and the time for diversification, and we can begin to understand why insect species are so numerous, and in some ways dominant on Earth. 1.3 Insect Body Plan. The body plan features of insects have, without a doubt, contributed in key ways to the impressive radiation of the group. Two characters in particular. EXTERNALFOLIAGE. FEEDNG. Permitted a series of novelties which resulted in their richness on Earth. They were primitively terrestrial and they had an exoskeletal integumentary system. Together, these traits facilitated a tracheal system of integumentary invaginations dividing through the body, providing air almost to the cells at work. With a permeability constant for oxygen through air of 660 cm2 per atmosphere, H compared to a permeability through water of 2A10A13 cm2 per atmosphere. H. Tracheae were extraordinarily efficient, thereby allowing insects to be highly active. Alexander 1971, see also Chapman 1998. However, every adaptation, such as an exoskeleton, has its own constraints, a hard exoskeleton limited size. This was because, to grow, an insect needed to cast its integument, while replacing it with a larger one. But this left the individual briefly vulnerable and subject to bodily collapse since the supporting exoskeleton had been abandoned. Nevertheless, the tough integument, tracheal system and small size provided extraordinary potential for evolutionary innovation, and we look at each of these in turn in this section. 1.3.1 Metamorphosis. The constraint of the exoskeleton and the requirement for molting also provided a new opportunity in insect design. An insect could change its shape from one mold to another. This metamorphosis resulted in larvae evolving with shapes and habits very different from adults. The caterpillar of a moth, butterfly or sawfly spends its life feeding and differs remarkably in design from the adult, while adults may or may not feed, but are involved mainly with reproduction, courting, mating and ovipositing. All insects with winged adults change from immature wingless forms to winged adults. About 9% of insects are hemimetabolous, with incomplete metamorphosis, for the immature nymphs are similar to adults except that they lack wings. But the large majority of insects are holometabolous, with complete metamorphosis, in which larvae are very different from adults, as in the caterpillar and butterfly. About 90% of insect species are holometabolous, including all the very large orders, Coleoptera, Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, and Diptera. Figure 1.2b, with the origin of holometaboly about 300 MYA. Kukulova, Peck 1991, Grimaldi and Engel 2005. This leaves about 1% of insects that are primitively wingless, including hexapods now classified outside the class Insecta Protura, Collembola and Dipleura, although they are commonly included in ecological studies on insects. These percentages are based on numbers of described species per insect order provided in Triplehorn and Johnson 2005. They illustrate a remarkable breakthrough in animal design through metamorphosis, especially the holometabolic form. Larval forms and habits are enormously varied, from maggots vermiform larvae to grubs scarabaeiform larvae to caterpillars eruciform larvae to active and often predatory campodeiform larvae, and long and slender elateriform larvae cf. Triplehorn and Johnson 2005. Maggots may squirm through mud, or animal bodies, mine in plants or live in water, while caterpillars are active as external foliage feeders, wood borers, leaf miners and gall inducers. Certainly, metamorphosis has contributed significantly to the adaptive radiation of the insects. 1.3.2 Exoskeleton and flight. The exoskeleton provided great strength in small structures, a strong skeleton to support heavy-duty muscular contractions and considerable protection against many enemies. Small size meant that gravity exerted a relatively weak force, equivalent to adhesion and cohesion for insects around 1 mm in length, went 1968, enabling adhesion to leaves, walls and ceilings, but making a drop of water a disabling hazard. Small size, the exoskeleton and the tracheal system also contributed to the evolution of the first flying animals on Earth. With gravity as a relatively weak force, gliding may well have been a possibility, with hardly any particular special. Named organisms. B. Insects. A. C. Lepidoptera. 160,000 Diptera 125,000. Hemiptera. Adaptation for flight. Any extension of the cuticle would improve the possibility of effective gliding, and articulation would result in controlled flight. Alternatively, articulated flaps acted as gills or gill covers in aquatic insects, that secondarily became modified for flying. No matter which processes were involved in the evolution of flight, and there are many hypotheses, e.g. Kukulova, Peck 1978, 1983, 1987, 1991, Gullen and Cranston 2005, Grimaldi and Engel 2005. Flying became a reality for the insects, and a major breakthrough in their adaptive radiation. Approximately 99% of insects can fly in the adult stage, or are derived from a lineage with flight price 2002a. The primitively wingless insects and other hexapods have remained a relatively depauperate group. 1.3.3 Small size. Small size, combined with flight, results in insects' ability to exploit small and scattered resources, with narrowly defined ecological niches, or places to live. As a consequence, they have specialized in the colonization of dung, carrion, tree holes, rotting logs, birds and their nests, other insects, pools, temporary streams and endless other microhabitats, see Gullin and Cranston 2005. Additional resources include pollen and nectar, blood, fungi, plant sap, fruits, seeds and other plant parts, often available in small quantities and briefly in the year. Just these few examples highlight insects as living almost everywhere, each species specialized for a particular way of life utilizing a particular resource. Even on small, remote, subarctic islands on which no indigenous terrestrial mammals and few birds are found, hundreds of invertebrates exist. About 120 invertebrate species have been recorded from Marion Island, 46s alone, with 17 families in 7 orders of insects present, Mercer et al. 2001. Marion Island Liasat 2,300 kilometers southeast of Cape Town, South Africa, with intervening islands, and a surface area of about 290 kilometers to Chow 1992. Insects are also found in thermal pools at 25 to 40 C in Yellowstone National Park, in brine lakes and deep in caves, e.g. Culver 1982, Fincham 1997. The success of insects is often noted, although usually without defining what success actually means. Clearly the term is subjective, so that quantifiable criteria are best employed to express the impressive adaptive radiation of the group. Most often used is the sheer number of species, but other factors need consideration, such as the diversity of morphology, lifestyles, their biomass per unit area, the rich relationships with each other and among species, and their many roles in natural and managed systems. We will examine some of these criteria in the following paragraphs. 1.4 Richness of the insect fauna. Figure 1.2 shows the estimated number of named species on Earth. As we can see from Figure 1.2b, the named insects number about 1 million species, Fudit and Adler 2009. However, most insects have not been named, and their numbers are unknown, but debated nonetheless. Some estimates converge on approximately 5 to 10 million species, or about 90% of all terrestrial animal species, e.g. Gaston 1991, 1992, Wundegard 2000, but others, based on sampling in the tropics, consider 30 million species more likely, Irwin 1982, 1988. Among the described insects, 90% are members of orders including many herbivorous species, with very large orders represented, Coleoptera, Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, Diptera, Hemiptera, Orthoptera and Thysanoptera, figure 1.2. The number of insect species is vastly greater than any vertebrate group, and even all vertebrates combined, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals, which add up to about 45,000 species. Bird species number something a little less than 9,000 species and mammals about 4,600 species, depauperate groups indeed. Other animals, in figure 1.2 it includes vertebrates other than mammals, and the many invertebrate groups such as sponges, corals, flatworms, crabs, spiders, snails and worms. Compare these numbers for whole classes of vertebrates with the species numbers for single families of insects. For the ants, family Formicidae, 8,804 species were described by 1990, but quite likely 20,000 species exist on Earth, Ho, L. L. Dobler and Wilson 1990. In the parasitoid wasp family Ichneumonidae about 15,000 species have been described, with a likely 60,000 species in the world fauna, Towns 1969. Towns notes that an Ichneumonidae genus is more or less equivalent taxonomically to a bird family. Insect biomass is equally impressive, with just ants and termites representing an estimated 33% of all animal biomass in the Amazonian terra firme rainforest, Ho, L. L. Dobler and Wilson 1990. Insects, at an estimated weight of 27 billion tons, outweigh the human population by about 6 times. In terms of biological mass, or biomass, insects are by far the dominant animal life form on Earth, Gristle 2001, p. 35. The numbers of individuals per species are also staggering in some cases. In an outbreak of forest caterpillars, numbers may reach 104 to 105 individuals per 100 square meters. Ants may number 20 million individuals per hectare in the tropics, and some driver ant colonies may even contain 20 million workers. Early naturalist explorers were amazed at the mass dispersal of Lepidoptera, like snowing butterflies. Even in our own gardens and landscaping around our houses, probably more than 100 species live, represented by thousands of individuals. Such biodiversity of insects needs protection as much as any other group. All species are impacted by reduced habitat through deforestation, expansion of agriculture and urbanization, and the fragmentation of habitat into smaller and smaller parcels, rendering populations at greater risk of local extinction. Thus, the conservation of insect species and populations is attracting greater attention and stronger resolve, e.g. Gaston et al. 1993, Samways 1994, 2005, Bassard and Carlton 2002, and see also the Journal of Insect Conservation. Protection of breeding sites for aquatic insects like dragonflies, restoration of habitat for others and monitoring of populations are all part of the conservation strategy and insect ecology. Naturally, much ecological research is needed to understand the status of species and populations, and the risks to which they are exposed, so conservation biology will be discussed repeatedly in this book. 1.5 Richness of relationships. Needless to say, the richness of insect species means that they are involved with an even richer set of interactions, for each individual species interacts with a multitude of others. Table 1.1 shows us that many species exploit plants in one way or another, exhibiting a wide range of resource exploitation, for every part of a plant may be utilized by one insect species or another. For example, a large oak tree may support several hundred species of insect, with almost all parts vulnerable to attack, including all stages from seed to seedling to the mature plant. Figure 1.3. Here, we discuss direct and indirect relationships by looking at feeding links and community interactions. 1.5.1 Feeding links and types. Moving up the feeding links, or food chain, the herbivores are in turn fed upon by carnivores, both insects and other animals such as reptiles and birds. Feeding on animals such as insects involves three main types: predators, parasitoids, and parasites. Predators generally kill their prey and consume most or all of the dead body. Parasitoids are parasitic in the larval stage but free-living as an adult, with a female parasitoid that searches for hosts in or on which to lay an egg. Thus, parasitoid species can be regarded as mainly parasitic because of usually long association with an insect host, or predatory because a female adult searches like a predator, usually dooming the host to death. This is because of larval feeding in or on the host, and, as a consequence, the parasitoid acts like a predator in relation to the population dynamics of the prey. Parasites of insects include microorganisms, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, mites, nematodes, and the larval stages of parasitoids. A parasite can be defined as an organism that lives in or on another living organism, which obtains part or all of its food from that organism, which is usually adapted by morphology, physiology, and behavior to living with its host and which causes some measurable damage to its host. See Price 1980, Bush et al. 2001. These categories of herbivores and carnivores cover only a small selection of relationships among insects, and their food sources. Table 1.2. Some interactions may be beneficial to each species, constituting a mutualism, such as in pollination. Mutualists may live intimately with each other, like the protozoa in the paunches of termites, with the protozoa and termites forming a symbiosis. Symbioses are not restricted to mutually positive relationships, as they also include parasites and their hosts in close association. Competition may be observed among any organisms that exploit the same resource in limited supply. And competition was thought to be most likely among members of the same guild, species that exploit the same resource in a similar manner. Figure 1.4, Root 1973. Such competition may be very one-sided, asymmetric competition, with one species hardly affected, but the other negatively impacted, a 0-A interaction, and competition now appears to be frequent outside guild membership, e.g. Kaplan and Dino 2007, Dino and Kaplan 2007, see Chapter 5 on competition. 1.5.2 Community interactions. Clearly, these interactions are very rich in any one locality. Such interacting species comprise a Table 1.1 The resources provided by plants utilized by insects, and their kinds of exploitation. Resources provided. Name of exploiter. Living plant or plant parts in general. Herbivore, phytophage. Eating plants and animals. Omnivore. Shoots. None leaves. Folivore. Buds. None flowers. Florivore. Nectar. Nectarivore. Anthers and or pollen. Anthophage. Carpel and or fruit. Fugivore. Seeds. Granivore. Spores. None cones. None wood. Xylem. Xylophage. Cambium. None bark. Cortex. Paraderm. None. Roots. Rhizomes. Rhizophage. Tubers. Corms. Bulbs. None. Sap. Phloem and xylem. None. Exudates. Oozes. None. Dead plant material. Saprophage. Detritivore. Decomposer. Slightly modified from Price 2002a. Reprinted with permission. Community of species, defined as a group of organisms that interact in a given area. These interactions may occur among species on the same trophic level, meaning the same feeding type, such as herbivores on plants or carnivores feeding on herbivores. Figure 1.4. The hierarchy of feeding relationships in a community can then be regarded as a food chain, or food web, with linkages from plants to herbivores, to primary carnivores, to secondary carnivores, and so on up the trophic system. Figure 1.4. Very simple communities may be more chain-like in structure, but usually web-like sets of interactions are observed, especially as predators tend to be more general feeders than herbivores and parasitoids. However, the diversity of relationships goes well beyond direct interactions because feeding, especially on plants, actually changes the properties of the plant. A caterpillar may roll a leaf which later becomes a haven and domicile for smaller herbivores like aphids and thrips. The aphids may excrete honeydew which attracts ants, and these may become predatory on other members of the community. Feeding damage may also change the chemistry of leaves, with beneficial or detrimental impacts on other herbivores. Herbivores on plant stems may result in altered architecture, with impact on others. Indeed, the indirect interactions of insects on others may be far richer than the direct effects. Ogashi 2005, Ogashi et al. 2007, Figure 1.5. Buds. Catkins. Acorns. Leaves. Twigs. Branches. Rot holes. Macrofungi. Trunk. Dead wood. Roots. Figure 1.3. A large oak tree, such as the pedunculate oak, Quercus robur, in the British Isles, provides many food resources for insects and other animals, and many habitats to live in. Modified from Morris 1974. Reprinted with permission from the Botanical Society of the British Isles. Table 1.2. The kinds of interaction between species. Type definition. Mutualism. Both species benefit from an association. Symbiosis. 0 or A0. The close association of two or more species living together, no matter which kind of influence one has on the other. Antagonism. One species has a negative effect on the other species. Predation. Parasitism, or both species exert a negative effect. Competition. Amensalism. A0. One species has a negative effect on the other, but there is no measurable Reciprocal effect, e.g. highly asymmetric competition. Competition, exploitation of a common and limiting resource by two or more species. Commensalism, 0. One species benefits from an association without any benefit to, or harm, from, the other species. Parasitism, individuals of one species live in or on a living host, sapping the host's resources for a relatively prolonged period, and exerting a negative, but not necessarily a fatal, effect on the host. Predation, individuals of one species kill and eat individuals of another species. The prey species. Inquilinism, 0. One species enters the domicile of another habitually, with or without causing damage to the host species. Browsing, eating tender plant shoots, twigs or leaves of woody plants. Grazing, feeding on growing herbage such as grass, nibbling or cutting its surface. Growth while passing across a patch of vegetation. Cropping, cutting off the upper or outer parts of a plant. Exophytic, external feeding on a plant. Endophytic, internal feeding on a plant. Obligate, a necessary relationship for the existence of a species or individual. Facultative, a relationship that may be used, but is not essential. Specialist, a species with a narrowly defined diet. Generalist, a species that feeds broadly across many host or prey species. Direct interaction, a species has an immediate effect on another by directly influencing the recipient of the interaction. Indirect interaction, a species influences another recipient species by altering the conditions to which the recipient species is exposed. A and 0 symbols denote a beneficial relationship, a negative effect or no effect on the other species, respectively. Modified from Price 2002a. Reprinted with permission. Figure 1.4a. Simplified food web based on collared plants, Brassica oleracea, showing 3 major guilds of herbivores, their parasitoids, hyperparasitoids and predators. Note that the predatory nabbed bug feeds on the second, third and fourth trophic levels, showing a general feeding pattern typical of many predators. Pit feeders include flea beetles, strip feeders are caterpillars, and sap feeders are sucking insects such as aphids. Based on Root 1973. Reprinted from Price 1984a, with permission from John Wiley & Sons, Inc. 1.6 Adaptive radiation. This richness of the insect fauna and the richness of their interactions obviously raises the question of how insects could become so numerous and diverse. We have discussed above body plan features which are central to the insect way of life, small size, a tracheal system, metamorphosis and flight in particular, and the antiquity of the group, but clearly there is much more to understanding how so many species are extant today. This subject enters into the realm of evolutionary biology, and especially adaptive radiation, the relatively rapid evolutionary divergence of members of a single lineage into a series of adaptive zones with different kinds of ecological niches. An adaptive zone is a way of life. Figure 1.5. The difference between feeding relationships of insects on willow in Japan, with 3 species feeding directly on the willow, and an indirect interaction. Web B, showing that insect activity on a plant changes plant traits which influence other herbivores, increasing the number of interactions among species from 3 in A to 10 in B. In the latter case, spittlebugs oviposit into shoots, killing the shoot tip, and promoting new vigorous growth. Basal to the damage. Interaction 7. This growth is attractive to leaf rollers, whose rolls act as shelters for aphids. 8. An aphid honeydew becomes attractive to 3 species of ants. 9. Ants have a negative impact on leaf beetles. 6. While aphids have an indirect effect on leaf beetles. 10. In all, this indirect interaction web included 6 direct interactions, 1 6 and solid lines, and 4 indirect interactions, 7 10 and dashed lines, and 3 direct interactions were newly established, which resulted from earlier indirect relationships. 4 to 6. From Oguchi 2005. Reprinted, with permission, from the Annual Review of Ecology, Evolution, and Systematics, Volume 36, #by-annual reviews. Common to a group of species characterized by a particular mode of exploiting the environment. Hence, the adaptive radiation of beetles Coleoptera would include many adaptive zones such as leaf feeding, e.g. chrysomelody, wood boring, cerambicity and buprestid, dung feeding, many Scarabeoidea, and aquatic and terrestrial predators, Didicidae and Carabidae respectively. Adaptive radiation is a large subject which will be discussed and amplified in other parts of the book, but here we focus on 3 contributing factors to the richness of insects. The first is the richness of plant species on which many insects feed, the second is the richness of herbivores which provide food for predators, and the third is the mechanisms by which insects divide into new species. 1.6.1 Plant diversity for herbivores. The basis for understanding the evolution of the multitude of insects rests on their relatively small size, trophic level linkages and the richness of plants at the base of the food web. Plants are primary producers, generating plant biomass through photosynthesis, which then becomes available to other organisms, consumers of various sorts, herbivores, decomposers and mutualists, like pollinators, mycorrhizal fungi and nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Plants provide a carpet of green over most of the earth, but only a small part of this biomass is palatable and nutritious enough for any particular species. Therefore, there are many thousands of ways in which plant biomass can be exploited. Each of the named plant species, numbering over 250,000, figure 1.1, may support several to many insect herbivore species, each herbivore specialized to a different plant part. As they are small and generally able to fly, insects utilize very small resources such as seeds, e.g. bruchidae, and widely dispersed resources such as pollen, e.g. apidae. So each plant species provides many different resources. That is, plants provide a diverse array of ecological niches for insects, the resources needed by a species to maintain its population indefinitely. Many herbivorous insects are specific to a single, or a few, plant species, and a particular plant part. For example, fruit flies respond to specific fruit odors of their host plant species, Lin et al. 2003. Indeed, many such insects act as parasites in their host plants, living in or on the host plant for much of their lives and feeding on the plant, thereby inflicting some damage. See Table 1.24 definition of a parasite. Hence, once a lineage colonizes a new adaptive zone, such as seed feeding or stem boring, it can spread through speciation across many plant species, with each host plant hosting its own insect species in that adaptive zone. With many lineages radiating in this way, for example herbivorous Hemiptera, Diptera, Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera, and Coleoptera, it is evident that any plant species will be colonized multiple times, resulting in a rich community of insects and host plants. 1.6.2 Herbivore diversity for carnivores. This scenario can be applied to higher trophic levels involving the primary and secondary carnivores. Parasitoids, in particular, are likely to be specific to a single host, or a highly circumscribed group of hosts, because their parasitoid larval stage lives in intimate association with host chemistry and defense. For example, in an abandoned damp field in southern England, 15 aphid species were parasitized by 18 primary parasitoid species and 28 secondary parasitoid species. Godfrey and Mu Diaresis Lur 1998, Mu Diaresis Lur et al. 1999, Figure 1.6. The primary parasitoids lay eggs inside the living aphid host, which then attaches itself to the host plant, and the exoskeleton hardens into a shell-like aphid, mummy. A group of 18 secondary parasitoids attack the aphid and the primary parasitoid while both are still active, before mummification. These are called hyperparasitoids because they attack the primary parasitoids. Another group of 10 species attack the mummified stage of the aphid, the mummy parasitoids, killing both the primary parasitoid and the hyperparasitoid if it is present. Thus, a small number of plant species, less than 20 species, supports 15 aphid species, attacked by 18 primary carnivores and 28 secondary carnivores, some of which act as tertiary carnivores when they attack hyperparasitoids in mummies, for a total of 61 insect species. And this just enumerates the aphids and their parasitoids in one field. Multiply this number by the many other kinds of herbivores and detritivores in the field, and their natural enemies, and we can easily imagine hundreds of species coexisting, each in their own ecological niche, all in one small damp field about 18,000 meters 2 inches area. Then multiply this number per unitary around the world, and the numbers of insect species at the various trophic levels grows to staggering ripeness. 1.6.3 Species formation. Of course, an important component of adaptive radiation is the process of speciation. Although this is regarded at times as a controversial subject, e.g. Howard and Berlocker 1998, we know speciation happens, and there are relevant points worth mentioning here. The parasitic lifestyle of many insects, both herbivores and parasitoids, means that they tend to be specific to their plant or animal hosts. See Chapter 8 on parasite and host interactions. They are adapted to find hosts, and to live with hosts, in specialized ways. Once a host is colonized, relatives of the host may be vulnerable to exploitation simply involving a host shift, a jump from one host to a related host. This may result in reproductive isolation and speciation, a process that may be repeated many times. Host shifting may occur within the same locality, resulting in sympatric speciation, or it could occur on either side of a geographic barrier involving allopatric speciation, or speciation in different locations. See Price 1996 for details. For example, it is apparent that during the radiation of the goldenrod plant genus, Solidago, 2 species formed in northern USA and southern Canada, S. altissima and S. gigantea. The specialist gallfly, Eurosta solidagenus, appears to have speciated into 2 reproductively isolated sibling species, one on each goldenrod host species. Abramson et al. 2003. In addition, speciation has occurred in the next trophic level involving originally a stem-boring predatory beetle, Mordella stenoconvicta, which has now divided into thestem borer and a new gallfly predator in the galls, Eubanks et al. 2003. Thus, speciation has moved up the trophic system from plants, to herbivores, to predators, representing what must be occurring commonly in countless other species associations. This sequential radiation was named by Abramson et al. 2003, page 781, to represent the escalation of biodiversity of the trophic system. Insect genera are frequently very large, numbering in the hundreds of species per genus, suggesting plant, aphid, primary parasitoid, hyperparasitoid, mummy parasitoid. Figure 1.6 part of a food web based on 2 plant species, and 2 aphid species, with primary parasitoids and hyperparasitoids, and mummy parasitoids attacking both primary and hyperparasitoids. Solid lines and arrows illustrate what are thought to be some of the strong influences in the dynamics of the community. Dotted lines and arrows show less important interactions. Modified from Godfrey and Mu Diaresis Lur 1998. Reprinted with permission from Kluwer Academic Publishers. Rapid speciation without great morphological differentiation. The superficially simple scenario of host shifting could account for this taxonomic situation. For example, the Cicadella genus, Erythronera, includes about 500 species, involving many host shifts among woody plant species. Ross 1962. Species fission by a host transfer mechanism, was Ross's considered view on the spectacular radiation of the genus Erythronera. Ross 1962, p. 188. The details involved are probably unique to each species and genus. Another suggestive feature of these large genera with many species on different plant species is that sibling species are common. Species that are very difficult even for a taxonomist to tell apart, or cryptic species, remain hidden from the taxonomist's eye unless particularly careful study is involved or molecular variation is considered. Sibling species would arise, in one scenario, by simple host plant shifts, with most habits retained on the new host, without demands for adaptation morphologically to the new host. Strong morphological similarity also suggests rapid speciation and rather recent speciation, or we would expect greater morphological divergence simply by genetic drift, or random genetic changes. Such sibling species are found in the genus Erythronera itself, figure 12.5, in sawflies, cynipids, fruit flies and many other groups. Among the fruit flies, one species pair in the genus Ragoletus could be distinguished initially only by electrophoresis, with one of the species appropriately named Ragoletus electromorpha, Berlocker 1984, an electromorph being an enzyme allele detected by electrophoresis. Adaptive radiation, and its component of speciation, is a rich blend of ecological, behavioral and evolutionary interactions. The ecology involves plant and insect interactions, insect host and parasitoid interactions, predators with prey species and the relationships among all these species in space and time. Therefore, this subject will be revisited many times in this book. 1.7 Ecosystem processes. Insects play important roles in ecosystem processes, as the list below indicates. All these roles that insects fulfill will be discussed in greater detail later in the book. 1. Insect herbivores convert plant and algal biomass into animal biomass. 2. Insects then become important food sources for primary carnivores, including many other insects and vertebrates such as reptiles, amphibians, birds and mammals. Insects feeding in freshwater systems on algae and leaf litter become important food for predaceous aquatic insects, amphibians and fish. Insects are vital components in moving energy up the food chain and food web. 3. Insects as herbivores and saprophages play a role in decomposition of plant biomass and its recycling of energy and nutrients. Chewed leaves pass out as frass, which typically falls to the ground, along with dead insects and cast integuments after molting. Insects chew up dead leaves, and bore into dead and dying trees, speeding up bacterial and fungal colonization and decay. Recycling of nutrients is accelerated. 4. Decomposition is also accelerated in animal corpses by colonization by flies, burying beetles and others, while dung is invaded, or carried off, also by many flies and beetles. These kinds of insects contribute importantly to the hygiene of natural landscapes. 5. We could argue with considerable justification that insects are their own worst enemies. So many species are predators or parasitoids on other insects that one can wonder how their prey species can persist at all, see Clausen 1962. Undoubtedly, carnivorous insects play significant roles in regulating their prey populations, but in turn they become food for higher trophic levels. Insects have been used extensively as agents in the biological control of other insects, in some cases with great success, e.g. DeBach 1964, Thacker 2002, Anonymous 2003, Hayek 2004. 6. Herbivorous insects also can have strong impacts on plant populations, either killing plant individuals or weakening them, thereby altering plant community composition and diversity. Forests may be killed by defoliators or bark beetles. Insect predation on seeds and seedlings may play a significant role in plant demography. The biological control of weeds relies in many cases on the activity of insect herbivores, be they defoliators, stem or root borers, gall inducers or seed predators, e.g. Van Driesch et al. 2002, Meyerstand Vasily 2003, Hayek 2004. Insect herbivores also act as important pests in agriculture and horticulture. 7. Pollination by insects is another essential function, for many plant species depend entirely on insects to transport pollen from one individual to another. Many crop plants depend almost exclusively on insect pollination, with a total value of these crops estimated at over $24 billion in 1988 in the USA, Metcalf and Metcalf 1993. The economic value of pollination worldwide in 2005 was estimated at €153 billion, approximately $198 billion US dollars, with by far the largest benefits for fruits, edible oil crops and vegetables, Galli et al. 2009. Crops range from apples, pears and peaches, to peas, beans and squash, and on to alfalfa, clover, cotton and sunflowers, with over 30 crop species included in the list. Native bees alone have been estimated to contribute over $3 billion per year in pollinating services for U.S. crops, Lassie and Bond 2006. 8. Insects even provide an important source of nutrition for humans in many countries, Menzel and Deluzio 1998. Caterpillars, dragonflies, cerambicid grubs, scorpions and tarantulas all make culinary delights for those accustomed to their crunchy, proteinaceous and fatty treats. Add to the direct consumption of insects entomophagy, the consumption of honey, and we can guess that the majority of people in any country eat insects or insect products. 9. Insects are critical in vectoring diseases of plants and animals. Many plant diseases are transmitted, especially by sucking insects, e.g. Carter 1973, Maramorisk and Harris 1979. Serious diseases in animals, wild and domestic, and humans are transmitted by insects, resulting in millions of deaths per year, and many more with debilitating conditions, malaria, dengue, yellow fever, sleeping sickness, plague, Chagas disease, West Nile virus and Lyme disease are but a few. The cost in human health, morbidity, mortality and suffering is almost incalculable, Busman 1976, Service 2004, Lehane 2005, Goddard 2003. Insects and other arthropods also cause direct discomfort by biting, sucking and stinging animals and humans. Ticks, mites, mosquitoes, tabanid flies, black flies, bed bugs, lice, fleas and assassin bugs all afflict members of the animal kingdom, as well as the stinging wasps, bees and some parasitoids. Malaria, caused by various Plasmodium protist species and vectored by many mosquito species, infects vertebrate species from snakes and lizards to birds, bats, rodents and primates, including humans. Over 300 million acute cases of malaria occur in human populations with over 1 million deaths annually, 90% in Africa, most in young children, accounting for 40% of public health costs, Bush et al. 2001, Rollback Malaria website 2009. Thus, there is a lot of ecology to understand. Who eats what, and how much? Why isn't more eaten? What limits the extent of feeding on plants, or on animals? And, how do humans influence such interactions, or benefit from them? How does floral design evolve in relation to pollinators, and what adaptations do the pollinators have that promote pollen transfer and nectar acquisition? The questions are endless, always providing entertainment while we hike, or spend time in the garden and yard. On the practical side, there are a multitude of questions about how best to manage medical, forest and agricultural pests, how to manage landscapes which minimize problems in pesticide use, how to conserve rare and endangered species of insects, and the habitats that they require for survival. 1.8 Ecological questions and answers.